Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that you've able to attend the session on marine protected areas and zoning. I'm Professor Lynnath Beckley from Murdoch University, the academic chair of marine science, and I generally deal quite a lot with undergraduate students. And in fact, I've pitched this talk at first year level for university because you guys are going to be there fairly soon. Less than 5 months, and you will be Mr. Ryan sent out to you. I carefully selected these places because they're very important, different levels of protection. They provide different levels of protection. Now, most of you had been to Rottnest Island, but very few to Hamlin Pool stromatolites or to the Great Barrier Reef. Now, the Great Barrier Reef is a very large protected area. It's 3,000 kilometers long, and it's managed by the Queensland government and also the Commonwealth. As a marine park. Ningaloo Reef, our very own on this side of the continent, it's the WA government and also the Commonwealth government. And pool stromatolites are really interesting, and there's a picture down in the bottom, the middle picture there, with those funny kind of brown things, which are about 5,000 years old. These are very rare things, and they are protected by a Western Australian marine nature reserve. Now, Rottnest Island, most of you have been there, and that is another fairly unique thing. It's a Western Australian Class A reserve. It includes both the land and the sea out to 800 meters. And then Esperance, which is down on our south coast and home of many, many endemic species that is only occur in Western Australia or Australia. It has absolutely no coastal protected areas. So just this little example shows you how complicated protected areas are, and hopefully today. So what I'm going to cover in this talk is I'm going to have a little kind of cartoon guide to MPAs, which I've received recently from the IUCN. Talk a little bit about marine jurisdiction. So you have to have laws to have marine protected areas. Then I'll talk about the different categories of protection, so you understand that. And then talk in depth about Commonwealth marine protected areas and Western Australian marine protected areas. And then I'm going to finish off with 3 topics, which if any of you go on in marine science, these are the things of the future. So it's not old history about creating marine parks. This is about what's happening in the world now. And I'll touch on the science of marine reserves, biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, and marine spatial planning. So here are little cartoons. So what is a marine protected area? Well, what are they? They are key tools for ocean conservation and management. And they're areas in the ocean that are managed over the long term, primarily for the conservation of habitats and species. But as you saw from that little poll that I did, the term protected area can refer to many different types of protection, and it leads to huge amounts of confusion. So let's have a look at what exactly does protected area mean. Some marine protected areas or zones in them allow almost all types of extraction. They can extract fish oil, they can do oil and gas, all sorts of things, whereas other marine protected areas prohibit all types of extractive use. Another question is, when does protection begin? When a bunch of well-meaning politicians sign off something, does that mean it's protected? Well, not really in my book. Or does it mean it's protected once there's a management plan and there's on-water policing and enforcement and monitoring of the protected area? That's more like what we mean when we talk about using protected area for management. As I indicated there, when does an area become protected? What are the stages of establishment of marine protected areas? First time is often when you area in the Kimberley, or designated once it goes through Parliament and is designated. Yes, there's going to be a protected area in the Kimberley, but then it has to become implemented. So you have to, it exists under law, but you have to establish the boundaries. You have to have a plan for management, and effective enforcement is in place. But it doesn't end there. The most important bit is when it's actively managed and it goes on for a long time, because that's when the benefits start to accrue. So it has monitoring, evaluation, and usually some sort of adaptive management. Now, this little diagram on the right-hand side here is a little sort of matrix of, along the top we have the stages of establishment. So all those four different things that I've just mentioned, and on the y-axis we have the level of protection. So the first one at the bottom is minimally protected, lightly protected, highly protected, and fully protected. So when it's just committed and designated, not much happens. Fishing can carry on and the fish remain as relatively few fish. But as soon as it becomes implemented, you start to see different things happening. So if it's lightly protected, things just carry on as normal. Minimally protected, lightly, you have maybe less fishing and maybe a few more fish. Highly protected, you start to have less fishing and more other activities. It could be scuba diving, it could be tourism. And then fully protected and implemented, you generally have lots of fish and lots of other uses of the environment. And it's the same sort of pattern once it's actively managed, if it's done properly. So those little cartoons, let's move on into the real thing, the hard stuff now. Marine jurisdiction, I don't know how much you've done of this sort of topic, but it's basically the laws of the sea. It's not like having countries like we have on the land. And if a marine protected area is set up, it's regarded as an area of the sea established by law for the protection and maintenance of biological diversity. So this map on the left shows the location of Australia, and around it is what's known as our exclusive economic zone. So that white line is a boundary in the ocean that's about 200 nautical miles, or it equates to about 360 kilometers away from our coast. And in that space, Australia can use the resources in that. We've got exclusive use, but we have to manage the resources in that. Once you go outside that boundary, you're on what's called the high seas, and this is areas that are common for mankind, and nobody really owns them. And so that's often a problem. If we go back to our Australian example, the area adjacent to the coast is actually called coastal waters, and that 0 to 3 nautical miles, or 0 to 5.7 kilometers, is actually managed by the WA government in our case. Once you go beyond that, out to the edge of the EEZ and anything else, that's under the Commonwealth jurisdiction. So Canberra calls the shots there, whereas the coastal waters, Perth calls the shots. Now, if we look at the different categories of protection in that little cartoon, it was very simplistic, going from lightly protected through to fully protected. The IUCN is an international union for the conservation of nature, and about 150 countries are signatory to this. And they've spent a lot of time sorting out categories for protection. And there are about 6 categories, going from a strict nature reserve through to category 6, which is a protected area, but with sustainable use of natural resources. Now, I've made it easier by crossing out 3 and 5 because they're not yet used in Australia. So let's have a look at the categories that we are using. And these 5 categories here. We have a strict nature reserve, an influx, which is a large natural area without human habitation. And if you look at, which is highly protected environment, and the most natural conditions are usually in protected areas, and you see category most natural conditions, or have the most natural conditions. Then we go to category 2, which is a large natural area to protect large-scale ecological processes. So we're not talking about little plots of the ocean here. We're talking about large extents. And you saw, I spoke about 3,000 kilometers for the Great Barrier Reef and 300 kilometers for Ningaloo Reef. So those goes a little bit further up, slightly, can have a few sort of unnatural conditions. Then you get to habitat and species management areas. These are areas which can be smaller, which are to protect particular species or habitats. And then category 6, which are the protected area with sustainable use of natural resources. So those are areas that conserves the ecosystem and habitats, and associated cultural values. So that's important because it's how we value it as humans, how we value those areas. Again, they need to be large, in natural condition, and under sustainable natural resource use and management. And they are slightly less in terms of to the Commonwealth MPAs, and I'll introduce those to you now. These were Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999. The categories of the Commonwealth MPAs very fortuitously match those of the IUCN, so that's why I introduced those first. Now, we've come a long way in the last 20 years. In 1998, before you were all born, there were very few protected areas in Australian waters, but there was the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and there was a little slither of Commonwealth Marine Park at Ningaloo, and a little slice down in the Great Australian Bight. But now, if you look at this diagram on the right in 2018, these are what the protected areas look like in the Commonwealth waters. It's a veritable jigsaw of pieces, different shapes and sizes, and I'll come back to that in a bit more detail. The colors actually represent different levels of protection. So in the Commonwealth process, now this is very long and political. It's gone from 1998 through to 2018, 20 years to get that system of protected areas up. And it started off with some oceans policy, a national oceans policy in 1988, where the government said, we want a national representative system of MPAs. So that set the scientists working, the marine scientists started to work very hard, and they produced what's called a national bioregionalization in 2006. That's the diagram with all the different colors on the top right, and I'll speak to that in a bit more detail later. From that, they made a subset. They lumped a whole bunch of the little regions together and made some major bioregions, in fact, 6 of those. And this required, they looked at profiles, what's actually happening in those areas. And this involved marine scientists, social scientists, and economists. And then in 2004, the first plan for the Southeast marine protected areas was released, and that was implemented in 2007. And then in 2012, the rest of the bioregional plans were released. But there was an election that year, and when to stop, and he'd first have to review them. So he set people up to review them, and it took them 4 years to review it. And then finally released the review in 2016, and lo and behold, there was less protection. And then finally, the management plans were accepted in 2018, still with less protection than what was in 2012. So it's a very long and political process. Just to show you some of these, just to go in a bit more detail into these provincial bioregions. Australia, as you know, has tropical and temperate areas. So the north, all those little colors and numbers are sort of tropical provincial bioregions. In the south, we have got lots of temperate areas, cool temperate and warm temperate. And those are all those green and blue ones in the south. We have a subtropical one in the middle of the west coast. It's odd, but they basically link the major temperate and tropical ones. And these are all bundled together into these 6 bioregions. And the numbers look a bit odd, but it was the order that they were done in. And the Great Barrier Reef was actually left out in this process because it had just been reviewed. Now let's have a look at the Southwest bioregional profile, because this is something you may have some familiarity with. When they produced this profile, they did a description of the marine environment. They looked at key ecological features, looked at the human activities, and also the conservation values. So if you look at this picture on the bottom left, that's an example of the bathymetry around the Capes region. We have this amazing feature called the Naturalist Plateau, sort of shallow water far out in the ocean. And the major picture there is about key ecological features. And there's all sorts of things of interest along our coast. We have the canyons. We've got canyons all the way along the edge of the shelf. Those are those little things that look a bit like worms. They're either black or blue. We can have the research archipelago, that orange bit near Esperance. The green bit is very deep water, 5,000 meters in the Diamantina fracture zone. And the pink is the naturalist plateau. And there's all sorts of things. Those little blue bits indicate some of the oceanography, sort of eddies trundling down our coast. Just some other examples of other data in food webs. So we've had, for example, pygmy blue whales, which are in the Perth Canyon, other side of Rottnest Island, in that deep water there. And they're feeding on krill, which is fueled by various phytoplankton that are caught, and lots of tuna and all sorts of other things. The other sort of interesting things, other sort of data that was gathered is the population, because the amount of population affects how much use there is on the coast and whether it was growing or decreasing, where the oil and gas, where the shipping was, the shipping routes. And then the middle one on the right, that's the commercial fishing, and the darker the purple color, the more commercial fishing there is. And the same with the recreational fishing. That was taken into account as well, because many people enjoy recreational fishing. And I won't go through the whole process, but eventually this is what we landed up with. And the different colors represent the different types of categories of protection. So if they're pink, that means that's category 1A. And if you look around Australia, there's not very much, but we do have some down at Macquarie Island, which is one of our islands down in the southeast, sort of near New Zealand. Green indicates marine parks, so that's category 2. And you'll probably notice that they're all kind of far from land. The yellow ones are habitat protection zones. This is category 4. And the blue ones are multiple use, category 6. So you'll find generally the blue ones are nearer to the land, where there's more contested space. If we move, I just have a quick look at this little matrix. This sort of looks at the different uses in marine protected areas. And I've looked up on the x-axis, we have the different categories from strict nature reserve through to protected areas with sustainable use, IUCN 6. And the activities, mining, commercial fishing, charter fishing, recreational fishing, research and filming. You'll see that things like mining and oil and gas can't be done in most protected areas. Commercial fishing, again, not permitted in 1 and 2. Charter fishing and recreational fishing, not allowed in 1A. Commercial tourism, research and filming can carry on in all areas on condition that you have a permit. So let's go across to Western Australia now, something closer to home. And this is in the coastal waters, generally 0 to 3 nautical miles off the coast. These are declared under the WA Conservation and Land Management Act, and the MPAs are vested in the Conservation and Parks Commission. This is a group panel of people put together by the government who oversee parks. They're actually managed by the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. And in WA, we always do things slightly differently. And we've got 3 types of protected areas. We have marine nature reserves. In fact, we only have 1. If you look at the map on the left, the purple color, it's only a little bit there for the Hamlin Pool Marine Nature Reserve. So we have 1 of those. Then we have marine parks, and they're in orange, and you see they're quite widely distributed. There's lots up in the Kimberley, got around 80 Mile Beach, and then we've got them near Ningaloo and Shark Bay and Jurien Bay and Capes region. And then we have an interesting one called a marine management area, and this doesn't really match IUCN categories, but it's uniquely West Australian, and that's up at Barrow Island and near the Muron Islands. So for these to happen, there has to be extensive assessment, community consultation and planning, and there are specific guidelines for access by industry. And just to go through those 3 types of protected areas, we've got the marine nature reserves, and these are equivalent to IUCN 1A. And they look but don't take areas. They provide the highest level of protection. And we've only got 1 example, and that's Hamlin Pool in Shark Bay, where these ancient probably 5,000 marine parks. Essentially, these are category 6, but that we have here in Western Australia are sanctuary zones, which are no take and very limited impact, low impact tourism and recreation is allowed. We have recreation zones, which are exclusively for recreation, and that includes recreational fishing, and general use zones, which can include commercial fishing, aquaculture, pearling, etc. And then we have some special purpose zones, which can be designated for a particular priority use. So it could be a special zone for whale watching or whale shark interactions or commercial fishing. So the last one is the marine management areas, and it's probably category 6. And because we have a lot of very valuable resources in the north, these were created. They provide an integrated management framework over areas with high conservation value, but which are also multiple use, particularly oil and gas. And the example I'll give here is the Muron Islands Management Area, which is near the Ningaloo Marine Park. It's a lovely place with fantastic reefs for snorkeling on. And just like I showed you for the Commonwealth ones, there is a matrix of what you can do and what you can't do. And by the time you're in a marine nature reserve, there's only a little bit of recreational tourism allowed. If you want to do petroleum drilling and production, basically a marine management area or the general use area, and possibly the special purpose use of marine parks. And how do we sort out how do we select marine protectors in WA? This goes back quite a long time, 1994, and there was a Marine Parks and Reserves selection working group set up, and they identified 70 places as candidate areas for MPA in WA. They achieved this through what's known as a Delphic approach. They all sat around the table, these knowledgeable people, and they used the best available knowledge at the time. It could have been conservation data, scientific data, and also recreational values. And it resulted in a very comprehensive report, which is actually known as the Wilson Report. And it's big and fat. You can see how big and fat it is. I treasure this copy because they're very rare. I don't even think it's scanned. Anyway, maybe I'll do that. And this is known as the Wilson Report. And here in this picture on the bottom right, that's Dr. Barry Wilson. He's unfortunately died now. But I really like this picture because it shows 3 generations of scientists that had worked at Ningaloo Reef, myself on the left and one of my honours students on the right. So what happened in WA? Well, it's just as convoluted as the Commonwealth. They produced this document in 1994 and not much happened till 2003. And then the Jurien Bay Marine Park was declared. Now that's not very far from here and it's a nice place to go to. And then the WA Premier, who was Jeff Gallop at the time, got very agitated and he said, this has got to speed up, we can't be so slow. And a whole lot of new marine protected areas were declared between 2004 and 2008. And Ningaloo Reef Marine Park was expanded a lot and much more protection put in. Rowley Shoals, Montebello Islands, and the Nornalup Marine Parks were all implemented. And in 2013, the Capes and Gurry Capes was implemented. And then in the last few years, we've had a whole spate of protected areas proclaimed and slowly getting managed and getting everything up to speed together with the traditional owners. And these are up in the Kimberley region, 80 Mile Beach, Camden Sound, Roebuck Bay, Horizontal Falls, which is that picture on the right, and the North Kimberley. So what does it look like when we started off, having some order in the chaos? We had the Shark Bay Marine Park and we had the Ningaloo Marine Park. And all these blue bits on the left-hand graphic indicate the 70 candidate areas that the working group said these would be good spots for protected areas. Zoom along quite a lot of years, 25, 26 years, and we're in this situation now. And I've shown you this graphic before. We've got a lot of protection in the north. We've got Ningaloo, Shark Bay, Jurien, Gurry Capes. We have a little one in the estuary or Nornalup. But we've got a very big hole on the south coast. And as you going off to study marine science, hopefully you'll end up working in this area and try and get some protection on the south coast, because these are all for endemic species. We have many, many endemic species on the south coast. They only occur in the south coast of Australia, and no one else is going to protect them on the planet unless we look after the habitats, ecosystems, and species of the south coast. And as I said, WA is often very different, and we've got some other types of protected areas. We have to have all these odds and ends. We have the Rottnest Island Reserve that most of you have been to, and I was actually there last weekend. It was fantastic. Very few tourists, but as lovely as ever. This was created on the Rottnest Island Authority Act, and it includes, you can see the map on the right there. It's quite unique. It includes the land and also the sea out to roughly 800 meters from the island. And in that marine part of the reserve, there are 4 sanctuary areas, the green bits where there's no take, and then 1 benthic protection on the west end where you can fish in the water column but don't take anything from the bottom. And then we have another very peculiar ones called fish habitat protection areas. And these were created under the Fish Resources Management Act to protect fish habitats. So these occur at Lancelin Island, Cottesloe, the Abrolhos, etc. And surprisingly, you can actually fish in some of them. So it's a little bit odd, but they are fish habitat protection areas. So they look after the houses of the fish. So now I'm going to come to some of these, finish off with some of these modern things that you will end up being involved with if you take up marine science and become a successful practitioner. A little bit of history here. Globally, there's 5 approaches used for the selection and prioritization of areas for inclusion in marine reserves. The first one happened in Australia and happened all around the world. It was very opportunistic. People would gather together and say, we have to protect Ningaloo Reef or something like that. And it was a very early approach. It wasn't very systematic. And my favorite example is from South Africa, where the Defence Force decided they wanted to test some missiles. So they decreed that this 50-kilometer stretch of coast at De Hoop on the south coast would be a no-take, no-entry marine reserve. And they tested all their missiles and then stopped doing that and left it as a marine reserve. And it is highly successful because it has all endemic species and they've been protected now for 40 years, which is fairly amazing. The second one, the multi-criteria scoring, this is very similar to what the Wilson report did. It ranks sites according to a set of criteria. It could be social or biological or pragmatic. The third one is how they did for the National Marine Bioregionalisation of Australia, looked at biogeographic zones and looked at things like number of species, percentage endemism. So the new things, or relatively new things, are ones that are more mathematical. And that's why I always tell marine science students to study maths as hard as they can. We have iterative selective techniques, which use algorithms such as complementarity analysis. And what they're designed to do is to minimize the area needed to protect a suite of species. It's very hard to get area devoted to conservation. So if you can minimize it and still protect the species, you're doing well. And in fact, the student and myself and I did a paper on this in Australia, radical site selection algorithms and hard play mathematical site, and they supplement each other, but now it's still increasing. People are using this method more and more often. The biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, known as BBNJ, this is for the protection of biodiversity on the high seas. And if you remember on the beginning of the talk, I pointed out that the high seas were the common property of all mankind. Well, that means that the fish and everything else in there, the whales, everything is also common property. And we cannot have open slather anymore in the high seas. So now the United Nations is putting together an international, what at the moment they call a legally binding instrument based on from the UN law of the sea. And this is developing, and this is going to develop over the next couple of years, probably into a treaty or a convention. and there's a lot of potential for MPAs on the high seas. So this is gaining a lot of traction, and it will definitely be in the forefront over the next few years. Australia is quite involved in this process. And finally, marine spatial planning, MSP. Now, the oceans are very highly contested spaces. There are lots of uses, and conservation is just one of them. So this looks a bit like a Zoom screen with all the different players, but we have, for example, shipping routes there, the green things. We have ports, we have lots of commercial fishing, we have tourism, commercial tourism. On the left there, we have undersea pipelines and cables, and these are vital components of our infrastructure. We wouldn't have the internet unless we had a cable between here and Singapore. Defense takes up a lot of bits of ocean for their practicing and trials, etc. A lot of us like to go snorkeling. The picture on the right there is actually the moorings at Rottnest Island in Thompson Bay. So all that is allocated to moorings. Oil and gas takes up a lot of space. Aquaculture, that's a lot of space as well for all these big pens. If you go down to South Australia, where they grow out the tuna. And then marine mining, deep sea mining, that's coming to us one of these fine days. It's already happening in other parts of the world, as is marine wind farms. The first one for Australia is probably going to come online in Melbourne, or near Melbourne fairly soon. And they're very prolific in Europe. And then we have the space that's dedicated to conservation. And the way this is working is there's a sort of step-by-step approach for marine spatial planning. And it's going away from the different silos. Instead of having just fisheries management or conservation management or shipping management, basically everyone's got to get together and sort out, all the stakeholders have got to sort out how to apportion space in the ocean. Now the little cartoon on the left is up in the Baltic Sea, which has got many countries around it, Sweden and countries like that, and Denmark and Poland. And the little sound there. So what's happening now is many countries, particularly Europe, but it's spreading all around the world, are engaging in marine spatial planning to make sure that marine conservation has its space in the oceans. And if you want to have a fun little video, go and look at this Become a Maritime Spatialist, whatever that may be, little cartoon on how to apportion different parts of the ocean. So that's a little wrap there. Hopefully I haven't gone too much over time. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. I think you're on mute still, John. Can someone unmute John?
Okay. What is the difference between a fish habitat protection area and a marine protected area?
Okay, so a fish habitat protection area doesn't have any of the other, it's not in law, and it doesn't have all the other attributes of protected area. It's only there to protect the substrate that the fish live on. You guys have got very big books. I hope you didn't write it all down.
Who would enforce marine protected areas on the high seas?
Well, that's one of the things that's being debated now through the United Nations, because if you set up conventions and treaties, then the signatory countries get involved. So for example, at the moment, there's a convention on tunas, and the different countries are involved in that. There's a specific convention, for example, for southern bluefin tuna, which we find off our coast, and that involves the countries that are fishing for that, and Australia goes to all those United Nations meetings about that. So it would be something that would be sorted out through the United Nations. So it'll take a long time.
Are there already whale sanctuaries set up somewhere on the high seas? Is that already in place, or is that not yet to happen?
Yes, no, that's correct. There is one in the Indian Ocean, is actually a sanctuary for whales. It's the only ocean where there is a sanctuary area for whales. So that's under a different convention. And if if a convention or treaty came up about BBNJ, then that would be included in it.
Do you think there should be further protection in the Perth metro area because of increased recreational fishing pressure?
Probably not, as long as we can protect. We've got Marmion Marine Park, we have Rottnest, and then we've got the Geograph Bay region. We also have Point Perrin, Shoalwater Islands as a marine park. So I think you have to be quite careful about just open slather, protecting everything everywhere. I mean, we may have lots of people fishing, but that engenders a huge amount of money to the economy. Think of every single person who buys a fishing stick and a reel and fishing gear and bait and boats and engines. All that sort of stuff contributes to the economy. And it's quite difficult to negotiate with recreational fishers, I've found in the past. But there seems to be a change of heart, and recreational fishers now, many of them are actually promoting conversations and conservation. And that is why, just to finish there, that is why it's very important to understand the biogeography of the species, because most of the species that we get in Perth are actually protected through the Jurien Bay Marine Park, which is much larger, and then the very big Capes one. So anything that's sort of endemic is picked up in Capes, and things that are more tropical or subtropical would be picked up in Jurien Bay. I'm not saying that some of the zoning couldn't be changed, but I think it's a very big deal to change a marine park altogether. Hello. Yeah, John needs to unmute himself. Can someone unmute John?
There you go.
What is the minimum size that MPA needs to be effective in conserving biodiversity, both at the community and species level?
Well, that's a million-dollar question. You better study marine science in a university for that, because it depends on what species you're looking at. The extreme is if you're looking at something like southern bluefin tuna, which have annual migrations of 6,000 miles, or whales, it's very difficult to actually protect the entire distribution of the animals. But this is done by a lot of algorithms and a lot of work looking at ranges, dispersal capabilities, genetics. So there's lots of things that go into that. So that's where marine scientists really come into play, particularly people with modern skill sets that can look at genetic taxonomy and systematics, that can look at running models to look at where the larvae would disperse to. So it's really imperative that people, students now who are thinking about going into marine science and have an interest in conservation are actually capable of doing the calculations and the studies and experiments that are needed to determine the size of the protected area. It's all gone very quiet. Can I just have a show of hands? How many people are interested in studying marine science at university level? Wow, that looks great. Maybe I'll see you next year. Okay, you're muted, Mr. Ryan.
Sorry, last question from me. If our national system was supposed to be representative, how is it that we missed that whole south coast of Western Australia? And yeah, what's happening with the talks to introduce some sort of protection in that area?
Okay, well, the bottom line is that at Commonwealth level, it's been picked up, but Commonwealth level is from 3 nautical miles offshore. The inshore bit is Western Australia's responsibility. It's not that it's been missed. They've been there as candidate areas, but setting in protected areas actually takes a lot of science, a lot of social science, and a lot of economics to be done. So I would guess that's the next cab off the rank. And in fact, if you ask WAMSI is actually putting together a program on the south coast of Western Australia. So hopefully there will be some money left after COVID to proceed with that. But in the meantime, you guys can start talking about it among your friends. Start telling them, you know, there's no protection along the coast. We've got no protected areas. I mean, the obvious one is the research archipelago. And even near some of that fantastic Bremer Bay inshore area, and the federal government or the Commonwealth government has actually put in, you know, those offshore Commonwealth protected areas so that you get the value of a sort of swathe of shallow to deep water, because often their nursery or their juvenile stages, and then move offshore when they're adults. So there's a lot of science behind these sort of things, and all the little bits that we do, have students do, different research projects, they all contribute to the big picture. So go and tell everyone there's no inshore coastal protected areas on the south coast. And it's the generation sitting there in those classrooms that are going to have to do something about it. We've done the rest.